start as I share this with you. One of the things that is incredibly important to me is to note. I'm not sure where that happened. So Cantor Keel, I do not have access to the. Oh, there's the chat. Okay. That when we sit to study Torah, it is an act of avodah. It is ritual action. We're not just learning together, we are coming together in community. And so I offer the blessing for study because this is a moment of connection, both with the divine, but also very much this human community gathered in this place. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kinshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I hope we have many opportunities as we go through this experience of literally soaking in the words of Torah. I start with 4 questions. And every now and then, if you see me look off in this direction, just realize that I'm sitting here in my office and we have foxes on our campus, red foxes, and they have been drinking out of a solar fountain I have next to me. So I've been having foxes running by my office all evening. It's been rather incredible to see. I just scared one to death because I moved my head. Questions. So nitty gritty flower power. And one of the things, if you want to put into the chat of why you chose this, what caught your attention about this topic, please feel free with that. Some of you who have crossed paths with me know that I really do love cooking. I'm also a garden. We use our garden at our synagogue to teach Jewish values and the Jewish values of taking care of the garden. And I have been doing a lot of baking, making sourdough bread, making challah over the course of the pandemic. It's one of the things I'm very fascinated with. But here we are on Shavuot. And Shavuot has a very powerful connection with grain and with bread. And we're going to be talking about that as we go forward. But here are 4 questions. When do we encounter wheat/grain in our daily lives? And as I say that, realize one of my children is gluten-free. And so when I say wheat, I'm always very conscious of that glutinous reality. And Cantor Keel, who is here, always tells me she likes to make the bread with extra gluten to compensate for my daughter. And so we're talking about barley, we're talking about wheat, but we're also, I want to include in that realizing there are people that can't consume wheat because it will actually could harm them seriously, if not kill them. That's kind of a challenge of talking about these types of things as well. So when do we encounter wheat or grain in our daily lives? When do we encounter and how do we encounter wheat, grain in Torah? And when I say Torah, I mean prophets, writings, the Hebrew Bible, I mean Talmud. In our literature, in our sacred literature, as our ancestors moved through the world and wrestled with God, when do we encounter wheat and grain? When do we encounter wheat and grain in our ritual and in our Jewish culture? Somebody already put something in there for about challah, about baking challah for elderly congregants, baking bread. With our cultures, challah is a basic and a simple one. We also 50 days ago were observing Pesach, where we had to get rid of chametz. We had to take the chametz and all sorts of rituals of taking leavened wheat out of our possession. And finally, what are the values around wheat or grain that we should be bringing into our lives? Those are 4 huge, huge questions. And I will tell you honestly, I have done this when I created this presentation, I put together an order. And then a day later, I came back and I changed the order. And then another day I came back and I changed the order. I'm not sure there's a right way to share the text that I'm going to. So, but I'm going to go through them. Please feel free to stop me and ask questions. But I want you to be thinking about these 4 questions about wheat and grain in our lives, in the Torah, in our culture, and in our ritual. And away we go. One of the phrases that is always with me is the one from Pirkei Avot. Im ein kemach, ein Torah, Im ein kema, ein Torah, ein kemach. Without bread, or without kemach is flour. Without flour, there is no Torah. Without Torah, there is no bread or there is no flour. We cannot engage in the work of Torah, Avodah, Gimilus, Chasadim without sustenance, right? If we don't have, I don't know about you, but I get hangry, right? If I don't eat regularly, I wish it was only 3 meals a day, but we'll start throwing in some snacks also. Then I can't be moved. There you go. We've got crackers on the table. It gets hard for me physically and spiritually and emotionally to be at my best. If we don't have sustenance, and Sheldon, you've talked a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have sustenance, then you can't get to those higher levels of being. And we sit there and talk about values, but let me back up. If we don't have those values, all the bread in the world isn't really going to fill us up if we aren't bringing values of human connection and human care, of chen, chesed, and rachamim, of grace and kindness and compassion in the world. We could have a table full of food, but if we don't bring values to that place, to that food, of how we eat it, how we share it, then it really is, and might fill our bodies, but eventually it's going to end up with a lot of emptiness in the world. And so I really love that idea of we are talking about wheat and grain, but also how would that help us with our values? And then as we're talking about our stories, how does that help us appreciate eating wheat or grain more? This has been one of the questions that is driving me. How much, I'm actually going to go back for a second, because before you even get to read the answer, how much wheat does it take to make 1 loaf of bread?
How much bread do you want?
1 loaf.
1 loaf.
1 loaf. How much wheat?
How much wheat do you what? How much wheat do you have to grow to make 1 loaf of bread?
A loaf is a pound, so it'll be like, I think it's 10 pounds.
So we will look at that. But I asked that question because how many of you have eaten bread today? Right? A lot of us have eaten bread, whether it's glutinous or gluten-free, right? How many of you have eaten something that has grain in it today?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
Right?
Lots of rice.
We consume it, and it's often hard for us to come to think about not just consuming it, but what are all of the steps that it took to get to us so that we can enjoy it? How much farm labor? Yes, challah and pizza crust, or challah pizza crust. How much labor goes into that experience of eating that pizza? How much resources? Yes, Myra?
It's monumental, and I don't think we ever think about it. We just go along and we eat.
And that's part of my challenge that I offer to you today, to start thinking in that terms of when we sit down to eat at least once, and we'll talk about that at the end, just even that stopping in 1/60th of that experience to appreciate how much goes into the fact that we're getting a chance to eat. You're going to see that more as we go further. Finally, here's an answer, and I can even tell you this is pretty good. It's about 500 grams of flour goes into making a loaf, right? I use about 500 grams in each of my sourdough loaves. And with heavy applications of artificial nitrogen, plus spraying with fungicides and pesticides, yields 10 tons of wheat per hectare of acre. If somebody's asking who is Andrew, this is just, I looked up the question. He's one of the naked scientists. So the link is down below. It's also on the source page. So basically a square meter produces 1 kilo of wheat. So if you need 500 grams, that's half a kilo. So that's half of a square meter. But if you don't want residues of toxic chemicals in your bread, you may want to be a careful farmer in fertile soil in case 5 or 6 tons of clean, nutritious wheat per hectare is possible. So that means a whole square meter of wheat for every one of your loaves of bread. That's kind of incredible to think about, that it's square meter, square yard, 3 by 3 feet for every loaf of bread.
3 by 3 feet.
And so for our congregation, around Sukkot, we'll plant some wheat in a square meter to experience that. If anybody has their congregation would like to join us in that endeavor, please let me know, because it's really powerful to consider that and think about that. Moving along, I just want you to kind of get a concept of what we're talking about. This is our gardens here at Temple Beth Shalom. This is from about 5 or 6 years ago. It might be longer than that. You can see here's some wheat growing. I got some wheat into the garden. It grew. And of course, the day before I went to go harvest it, I came back the next day and the squirrels had eaten it. But you can see there's some pretty good heads of wheat that are here. So you have this wheat. When it's dry, it dries, and then you harvest it before the squirrels. And then you get this stuff. This is a mass of dried wheatgrass and wheat heads in a container. You can see I'm wearing a boot. So Cantor Keel, here's photographic evidence of 5 or 6 years ago when I had the broken foot, because that's when I took this picture. And how do you get to this stage? Can you all see the little grains of wheat?
Yes, yes, yes.
That is, that's threshing. Thank you, Ellen. That's a great image. You actually take and you beat on it to separate the wheat from the chaff. The grass is all called the chaff, and you're separating the wheat from the chaff. How do you then get rid of the chaff?
Toss it in the air.
Yes, you blow wind. I don't have that picture. You blow wind through it, right? You can either toss it in the air, you can blow, it's called winnowing. And there's a great picture of me at Camp Coleman, URJ Camp Coleman in Cleveland, Georgia, of winnowing. We had a big bowl, we're blowing into it, and there's I have stuff all in my hair. It was great. So you thresh, meaning to separate the wheat heads from the chaff. You winnow, which means getting the chaff, which is lighter, to blow away, so you're just left with the grain. And then finally, what do? You grind it, okay? You can see a rock here, and that's starting to be flour, right? We did not use this flour because, it's rather gross rock, but we were kind of just demonstrating for our religious school kids, we were demonstrating for our families of what you do for all of these steps, because I buy flour, 5 pounds of flour in the store, and to come in to bake my bread and to make my recipes, I don't think about how much wheat that takes. This gives you a sense of all of the different steps of labor. There's also a wonderful, wonderful book called The Little Red Hen and the Passover Matzah, which does a great demonstration of this. If you would like to do this with your congregation, let me know, because we've actually done this, and actually Bill Compton made a table for me. As soon as we're out of this COVID state, we will set it up. You can go from threshing, winnowing, grinding to baking in about half an hour. It really is an amazing experience to do, to feel all of those steps. And there you can actually see the flour that's coming from the grinding of the wheat grain. Ellen, you were doing great demonstrations of what this looks like. I'm wondering if you or anybody else has actually done the harvesting and the threshing and the winnowing and the grinding. Bill, do you have any comments about it?
Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah, I was there when we did it. It's a very interesting problem or process. We were using a grinder to actually make flour, and we had to put it through at least twice, because the first time it went through, it didn't grind everything. You had to put it back through a second time. But it was very interesting to have the children there, because they were taking the sheaves of wheat literally separating the grain and then throwing the shaft off it and actually taking the grains and grinding it. And I actually learned a lot. I have never done it before. I always just went to the store and bought my flour. But it was very interesting to make the flour from being on the plant to being in a dish.
And I think we don't take the fineness and the quality of our flour. I think we take it for granted. One of the things about challah, Ellen, I see your hand. I'll come back to you in just a minute. One of the things we don't realize is how much that has changed in the modern world. That, you know, in 100 years ago, that they were using barley and rye and other grains for their bread during the week. Challah was used for flour, high quality wheat flour was used. That's why it was such a special thing just for Shabbat. Ellen, coming back to you.
Isn't the all the different kinds of flour, like whole wheat, is like a first or second grind, and what our AP flour is a multi processed flour.
And some of the germ is removed. There's all kinds of different parts of it. You are absolutely right. So I want to keep going. And I'm hoping that this will disappear. There it goes. Okay. One of the reasons why am I talking about this specifically on Shavuot? In the midst of our journey through the days and weeks, we find ourselves in the midst of the Sphira to Omer, the counting of the Omer.
Yes.
The sheaf of the barley offering, a ritual that took place in times. Barley was harvested at Passover. 50 days, they're counting and watching how much barley are they taking in, and are they going to have a successful wheat harvest? Fittingly, this week's portion contains the original commandment: from the day in which you bring the sheaf of the elevation offering, you must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days, bring an offering of new grain to the Eternal One. Why are they bringing grain? Because it's their first of their harvest. Just like Hanukkah is the first of the harvest of the olive oil, Shavuot is part of this celebration of, wait, we are going to have a wheat harvest. We want it to be successful. Thank you, God, for making it successful. In biblical times, the counting of the Omer was more than a mere ritual to the Israelites who worked the land. It was a concrete symbol that opened the summer season with the ripening of the barley and the beginning of an offering to the temple. They would count the days until the presentation of the 2 loaves that were baked on the first of the wheat harvest and brought to the temple on Shavuot. The third and most compelling, this is from Noga Haruveni, one of the founders in Neot Kedumim, a nature reserve of the biblical landscape in Israel, explains convincingly that this period was a time of great uncertainty for Israelite farmers. So in the Babylonian Talmud, it underscores this teaching. The north wind is beneficial to wheat when it's reached the third of its ripening, but that same wind, which helps the wheat, hurts the olive trees because that's when they've blossomed. So if the wind is coming from the north, it helps dry out the wheat. But at the same time, it impacts the olive trees because they're flowering and they need the wind coming from the right direction in order to make their fruit, to be fertilized so they're making their fruit. The southern wind is damaging to wheat when it reached its third of its ripening, but is beneficial to the olives when they've blossomed. Because of the instability of weather, one is wholly unsure if the crops will yield plenty or famine. As we've been counting the Omer, not only are we talking about the people of Israel going from Egypt, from Mitzrayim, a stuck and narrow place, starting their walk of freedom and arriving at Mount Sinai. In the land of Israel, this is a tipping point for their agricultural cycle, which is absolutely amazing to think about, because this is going to determine if they have flour for the next year and olive oil for the next year. 2 of their staples. You're going to see how important that is in just a moment. And if the wind blows from the wrong direction for the wrong amount of time, they have famine. if it blows from the right direction and the right length of time and they get the right rain in their season, suddenly there's plenty in the land. I'm experiencing this now. I had to go out and water my garden today. And if I don't water in the right times, and I'm in Florida, it rains here all the time. We haven't been getting rain for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I will tell you how quickly, how quickly the plants just shrivel up and disappear if you don't get a good amount of rain in the right season. I was talking about olive oil, which we've also pressed olive oil. We actually made an olive press. It was really an incredible experience. Bill probably likes grinding grain a lot more than crushing olive oil and running the olive press. But it was an experience. Someday we'll get a cider press and that'll just make it a little bit easier for us. But olive oil, bread, and wine. When do we use oil, bread, and wine? What holiday ritual?
Rosh Hashanah, the New Year,
Even more regular than that.
every Friday
Every
night.
Shabbat.
Friday night.
Shabbat.
Every Friday
Every time we
night,
have Shabbat.
every Friday night we use wine, challah, and olive oil is in the is how you can kindle the nerot, is how you kindle the
Like
how you kindle the lights. A lot of you use candles. We use olive oil lamps here. But olive oil was what they used for kindling.
Mhm.
And so look at this. This is the second paragraph of the reading of Shema. It has disappeared from Reformed liturgy. It is back, actually, it's on page 117 of the Shabbat book for Shabbat morning as an alternative version of this, but it's really a beautiful paragraph. If you will earnestly keep the mitzvot that I give you today, to love God and to serve God with all your heart and soul, I will give your lands rain in the proper season, the autumn and spring rains, and you will gather grain, wine, and oil. I will fill your fields with pasture for your flocks. Here in this, we get all three of those symbols. And I am always drawn to that phrase of the grain and the wine and the oil. Why those three and why do we use them on Shabbat? They are such the symbol of partnership between human and divine. And not just human and divine, not just, oh, thank you, God, I have wine, oil, and grain, but the partnership within human community. You do not make wine on your own. You don't make olive oil on your own. You don't really make flour on your own. All three of them need God to provide light and soil and safe periods of time and nutrients and all of those things that they need to grow. And then once you harvest them, you don't just eat an olive. You can just eat a grape, but you don't then just eat the wheat. Each one of them to make those products take a lot of human ingenuity, a lot of human energy, and a lot of human infrastructure to be able to have them. And they all happen over time. And so here we're seeing this reminder of how central they are to part of how do we show that God loves us and we love God is with that partnership. And here it is talking about that, including the grain. And it goes forward into some rather incredible theology. If you listen to God, God will take care of you. If you don't listen to God, and there's the way that Mishkan Tefillah talks about this is if we make gods of our own power or pleasure, then heavens will close up and the world will become inhospitable. So that is what's in this second, the theology is part of the reason it disappeared Reformed Judaism. But I think in the process of taking it out of Gates of Prayer and the Union Prayer Book, we lose that sense of how do we understand our relationship with the divine in terms of what the food resources we have. Here is another little piece that I show you, because that was literally about grain and appreciating grain, because if we don't have grain, we don't eat, whether it's beer or bread. Here is one that it's not just growing and eating, it's transforming the grain. If you, I just showed you how we thresh, winnow, and grind, right?
Mhm.
Look at what Isaiah does. And by the way, I did this with a group of bar mitzvah kids where I gave them some of the grain. They got to pull it apart. They separated the chaff. 3 days later, I was sitting with one of those students. She was reading her Haftarah, these words. I will make you a threshing board, a new thresher with many spikes. You shall thresh the mountains to dust and make the hills like chaff. You will winnow them, and the wind shall carry them off. The whirlwind shall scatter them, but you shall rejoice in the eternal and glory in the Holy One of Israel. If I hadn't stopped to thresh, winnow, and grind with that student, she would have had no idea what this was. Having the experience of threshing, winnow, and grinding, it allows us to get into this illustration of God's power of taking a challenge, the mountains and the hills, those things that are insurmountable, and being able to just brush them away. To be able to work them through and work them down so that we're able, and then having the wind of God come up to pick them up. There is
There's a question in the chat, by the way, whenever you want to
go ahead.
Okay. Jackie says, Rabbi Birnholz, how did our ancestors learn to make olive oil from olives, wine from grapes, and bread from wheat?
That's a great question. I think there's some chicken and egg. She's asking, did the creator teach us? And I think the answer is yes. Either God, showed humanity how to do it, or it's our human ingenuity and creativity and ability to pass stuff from generation to generation, which for me is a sense of the divine. Our ability to look at a problem and work it through and then tell the next generation, wait, this is the solution we worked out, to be able to go to to get to that place of being able to do those transformations. It's a great question because it's hard to fathom how that stuff happened over so many years and generations. So I wanted you to start seeing that we're not just talking about bread. It's this whole way, how do we create the bread that we have? And how does that language also become part of our spiritual experiences? It is Shavuot. I want to share a little bit of Ruth with you, that one of the things that is our responsibility for Shavuot is to tell the story or to hear the story of Ruth. Do I have a volunteer that would read?
She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For in the country of Moab, she heard that the Eternal had taken note of the people and given them food.
Okay, so I want to explain a little. Who's the she? Is Naomi. Naomi is from Judah. She and her husband Elimelech went to Moab. They crossed the Jordan River. They go into Moab. Their two sons get married. Their two sons, her husband and the two sons die. She is left with her two daughter-in-laws. And she says to the daughter-in-laws, don't worry, you all go back to your family's house because I'm going to head home. Ruth, one of the daughter-in-laws, says, no, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Wherever you go, I will go. And Ruth converts to Judaism. She becomes part of this Israelite tribe as she throws in with Naomi. These, by the way, are the verses that have to do with grain. I felt it was safe enough for me to be that selective. So here we have, and why are they going back to Judah? Not just because they don't have resources in Moab. The Eternal had taken note of the people and given them food. It was so subsistence. And if you've spent time in Israel, you know how hot and dry it is for a period of time during the summer. If you don't get the right rains in the right seasons, you won't have food. And if you get too much rain in the wrong season, you won't have food. In this case, the Eternal, as opposed to, that's actually, I'll come back to that in just a second, Dan. So here is Ruth, or sorry, is Naomi and Ruth, and they're in Moab. They don't have resources, but God has shown favor in the land of Israel. And so they are returning back, or Naomi is returning Ruth is coming for the first time, and they are coming back to Judah. Okay, so Dan is asking the question, was Ruth was the first who converted to Judaism? It's kind of complicated because in some ways Abraham and Sarah I have to come back to that, Margot. Abraham and Sarah kind of adopted Judaism. They had people in their clan, in their family, that become Jewish. There's also Bitya Bat Paro, Pharaoh's daughter, that we're told about in the Moses story. So there's lots of people that kind of join up in all kinds of different things. Margot, where are you going with the Latet Lahem Lechem?
Just the well, because it doesn't say give them food, gives them bread. It's just the alliteration of it.
Got it. Right. So that phrase is God had literally provided bread for them.
But also just the way latet lahem lechem. It's just like it has this poetry to it.
So I was sharing this with my students this morning. Where are they headed? What town are they headed to?
Bethlehem. Bethlehem.
Which means?
The house of bread.
So they're headed back to the house of bread. This is definitely appropriate for Shavuot. So Naomi returns from the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite, and they arrived at Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So pop quiz, what holiday celebrates the barley harvest?
Is it Sukkot?
Pesach.
Oh, right.
Pesach is the barley harvest. Passover is the wheat harvest. Okay.
You just said Pesach was the wheat harvest and the barley harvest.
That's right.
I'm confusing myself and you. It's 10 o'clock. This is past my bedtime. So my apologies there. So Pesach is the barley harvest and Shavuot is the wheat harvest. Did I get it right that time?
Yeah.
Okay. So they're arriving in time for Passover, and they're arriving at Beit Lechem, the house of bread, quite literally, for our bread topic tonight. So, would someone read chapter 2, verse 1? Ellen, would you read?
Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain behind someone who may show me kindness. Yes, daughter, go, she replied, and off she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers, and as luck would have it, it was a piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's family.
Okay, so coming back to the same clan or tribe that Naomi's husband was from, so this is all in the family. And when it talks about gleaning, have you all heard the word payot before? What are payos?
Corners.
They're the corners of a man's beard. Okay, or Canterkeel's hair. But a paya is also the edge of the field. And so you're required to leave 1/60th, the payot of your fields, also the gleaning. So part of the gleaning is when you go through the harvest, if stuff falls or you forget to pick something, you have to leave it there for the widow, the stranger, and orphan. So here she's coming and looking for a place to eat, to get food from, right? And she needs to have fortune. And what does she do? She happens to find a field to go get her gleanings that is part connected to the family that she has been adopted into. Was there someone that would read chapter 2, verse 7?
Go ahead.
I can do it.
She said,
Okay.
please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. She has been on her feet ever since she came this morning. She has rested but little in the hut. Boaz said to Ruth, listen to me, daughter. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls. Keep your eyes on the field. They are reaping and follow them. I have ordered the men not to molest you, and when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn.
You can keep going, Dan.
At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here and partake of the meal and dip your morsel in the vinegar. So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain and she ate her fill and had some left over.
And so I love this piece of the story of Ruth because, first of all, you're getting how fortunate. There is chen chesed and rachamim. There is kindness and compassion and grace in what Boaz is doing. Seeing her, she is that vulnerable, and he is creating the space and making sure she has her fill. Okay. And I will freely admit that there are other ways of reading the story that sound a lot more predatory, but I'm going to set that aside for the sake of looking at it through this lens of, are there ways as we move through the world to look for someone that is in need, that is struggling, that is vulnerable, that we can share some of our resources so that they are so that they feel more firm in their steps, right? And so I read this and I think of, what is Boaz doing? He sees Ruth, he sees her vulnerability, and he gives her a shelter under, yes. Thank you, Cantor Keel. Yes, that gets into what, how vulnerable she was in this position.
It doesn't actually use the word molest. It uses touch. So, you know, they won't beat her up or whatever.
She's vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
She has no resources. She's dependent on these gleanings. Boaz is offering her not just sanctuary, but there she's having food, and she has a little left over to take to Naomi. When she gets up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workers. You're not only to let her glean among the sheaves without interference, okay? So she's allowed to come in and get whatever she needs, but also pull some stalks out of the heap and leave them for her to glean and not scold her. So he is going so far above and beyond to make sure she is able to find resources. She gleaned in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it was an ephah of barley. So he is not just giving her a couple of cents that are in his pocket. He's not just saying, go get a cup of coffee. This is kind of the highest level of Maimonides' levels of tzedakah. He is providing her the resources so that she is able to get on her feet. And she goes later to then say to her own is Boaz, her kinsman, whose girls you're close to, who winnow barley on the threshing floor tonight. And it turns out that Boaz is able to be a redeeming presence. They end up getting married, and then there's begots, and this leads to David. So part of it, for me, as we're looking at and talking about Shavuot, and we're talking about bread, ein kemach, ein Torah, ein Torah, ein kemach, is this. As we are having our sustenance, as we are sustained, what are the values? What are our responsibilities for looking out at the world and seeing that somebody else might need sustenance, that somebody else is vulnerable, and finding those ways that we are able to share, to be able to provide some of that we have as blessing, to be able to take care of people in need around us. That's one of these pieces as we're reading the story of Ruth, and as we're eating, to be thinking of the story of Ruth and Boaz. How do we bring that to life?
He has 10 more minutes.
Okay. The second one, and it's interesting, there was some discussion in the last session I was in, there was some discussion of Christian sources. I am going to tell you that this is actually from a Christian website. And if you go look it up with the link, you will find Jesus stuff that's in here. I have taken the Jesus stuff out for the sake of us being able to look at the text, but it doesn't mar the text, because these values you're about to see are very much Jewish values. They're in some ways very universal values, and as you can see, these are all Jewish texts from Ruth, from Isaiah, from Deuteronomy, from Isaiah. A threshing floor, right? So in addition to that idea of sharing food, you also get this whole image of the threshing floor. Threshing floor is a smooth, flat surface that was used to process harvesting grain. Before the machinery, farmers used a threshing floor to separate the grain from the chaff. The harvested produce would be spread over the threshing floor, and animals, cattle or oxen, would lead over it to break the sheaves apart with their hooves. At times, people used sticks to beat the sheaves apart. The grain would be separated from the husks or the chaff, tossed in the air so that the wind could blow the chaff away, leaving only the good edible grain. That was winnowing. The threshing floor is important in the biblical story of Ruth and Boaz. In those times, if a woman's husband died, it was difficult for her to survive on her own. Very often, the woman would need to be redeemed by her husband's kinsmen. And I realize there's all kinds of power and gender and relational stuff in that. I realize it's there. I'm kind of just setting it aside, not because I don't think it's important to have a discussion of it, but I also want to teach tonight. I was trying to teach something different. Here, Ruth is encouraged by her mother-in-law, Naomi, to go down to the threshing floor where Boaz was winnowing barley. She was waiting until she had finished eating and drinking, was lying down for the night, and uncover his feet to lay at his feet as a symbol for her desire to be redeemed by Boaz. The connection between kinsman redeemer and the threshing floor in the story is likely not incidental. The threshing floor is symbolic of judgment in the Bible. We saw that in Isaiah. The Old Testament prophet Hosea prophesied that Israel would be like the morning mist, or like the dew that goes early away, like the chaff that swirls from the threshing floor, like smoke from the wind. So if we're talking about being cursed, right, or not having any substance, that God is just, if you don't cling to God, then God's going to treat you like chaff. You're just going to get blown away. Other nations who will come against God during the end of times, Micah says they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan. Gather them as sheaves on the threshing floor, right? To pound them out and to get rid of the chaff. The idea that Israel will demolish their enemies like oxen trampling grain on the threshing floor. Chaff is referred to in Psalms as a symbol of destruction of the wicked. Finally, the threshing floor has a spiritual significance, as a place where good and evil are separated. When Ruth comes to the threshing floor, she is in need, and Boaz responded to Boaz's previous kindness and generosity. She has learned that he is a good man. She trusts him. The fact that her petition takes place at the threshing floor among the grain and the chaff is a beautiful symbol of a man's need for redemption and God's identity as the Redeemer. Right? So here you have this place where, why on the threshing floor? Because the stuff that is incidental, because the relationships that are superficial, they get blown away. And the stuff that will really sustain you is what's left behind. It's just another, and for some of you, that image is going to speak to you. Other people, it won't. That's why I'm bringing you all of these different stories, because for some, it's going to be how Ruth and Boaz interact in the field. For some of you, it's going to be this image for the threshing floor. Different pieces of this journey of wheat going from the field and coming into our bodies are going to speak to each of us in different ways. But let's have a bigger picture of it so we can appreciate it and apply those values in our lives. And that's where I get to this last piece. I'm trying to wrap up so you can get to the next set of sessions. We have from Deuteronomy this line, Kakatu v'alchata v'savata uverachta et Adonai Elohecha al ha'aretz hatova asher natan la. Baruch atah Adonai al ha'aretz v'al hamazon. This comes from Birkat Hamazon. And at URJ summer camps, you sing this at every meal. Kakatu v'alchata v'savata. Okay, Susan, I see you singing along and moving your head. It's got a great rhythm. It's got good rhythm. You know, it's good Torah language, right? All of us, a lot of us, if you have sung Birkat Hamazon, you have it in your ear and you have it in your head. I had this incredible experience at Camp Coleman that I was in their garden at Campscape at Camp Coleman. The sign with this quote on it was sitting there in the garden, and I pointed it out to the kids and I said, do you all know that text? And they're like, no, we've never heard it before. And I said it to them and like, no. And then I started singing. They're like, oh, they didn't connect Birkat Hamazon and what we were saying in the dining hall with that idea of what are we doing in taking care of the garden. And I'm sure they're not the only ones. It is a powerful reminder when we are talking about, and if you're singing Birkat Hamazon and you use this line, to stop and say, as I'm enjoying my food, how do I think about the field? About the resources God provides so that stuff grows, about the workers that are harvesting it, about the people who transport it, about the people who process it until it gets to me. Which leads me to the last place. And I started with Ein Kemach, Ein Torah, Ein Torah, Ein Kemach. And we talked about how study, and we did the blessing for study is the way, because we're all engaging in community. I hope that the next time you take a bite of bread, that some of this sticks with you, that some of these words of Torah are like flour and help sustain you, that act of eating will be connected to the thoughts about the values you carry. So I thought it was appropriate to finish with the blessing for eating bread. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which we now know means a lot more than just praised are you Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who causes bread to come forth from the earth. That in fact, as we're talking about bread coming forth from the earth, it's all about our human relationships. It's all of our rituals that tie us into these values. It's about sustaining ourselves, mind and body and soul. So thank you all so much for joining me on this Shavuot. I am going to go and have a slice of beer bread. You will see on the Google Doc, and I'll actually right now put it into the chat, my email. If anybody wants one of my recipes, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. I have some great stuff that I just find in other places and use it. If you would like more of these garden lessons, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to share. And I know some of you said you might be interested in that pulpit exchange for teaching. Again, I would love to do it. It is powerful to hear from other teachers to be able to share those resources. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you. Chag Sameach, and have a wonderful Shavuot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very much.
Thank
It was
you.
very